Good evening, everybody, and welcome again to Café Scientifique. Tonight we're going to talk about seagrass, and our speakers tonight are from the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, Dr. Tim Ferrero and Ellie Parker, who are part of the Solent Seagrass project, and they're going to tell us about why we should worry about seagrass, why it's important, and I hope we'll learn a lot more. So let me now hand over to Tim, and over to you, Tim.
Well, thank you for clapping already. That's fantastic. Thank you, John. So I'm Tim Ferrero. I'm the Senior Specialist for Marine Conservation at Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, and my colleague Ellie Parker is a marine officer, particularly involved in seagrass restoration and managing our volunteer efforts at the trust. And we are going to be talking about our seagrass conservation and restoration in a wilder Solent. The word wilder is key here because it links very closely to the trust's Wilder 2030 strategy, which has three main headline goals. I'm not going to read all of the small print here, don't worry. Number one, nature recovery, 30% of land and sea protected and recovering by 2030, quite challenging. 1 in 4 people across the 2 counties taking action for nature. It's really quite a challenging target. And the third one I will read out, nature as a solution. So we have nature is playing a central and valued role in helping to address local and global problems like climate change, pollution, flooding, food security and public health. And hopefully by the end of the talk we will have sort of demonstrated how this seagrass work that we're doing really sort of talks to those 3 headline goals. So we're a wildlife trust, we're part of a federation. I have to ask this, any members of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust in the room? That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And a big enough audience to be a representative percentage, so that's brilliant. But we are geographical. We have 46 trusts geographically located, and the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts that deals with national issues, and that's normally what you see on the news when they talk about the Wildlife Trust. That's that body. This is our region. So the Hampshire border from roughly halfway down Chichester Harbour, out to sea that way, and on the western side down here always annoys me quite a lot because I grew up in Highcliffe, just there, and in 1974, 35 Walkford Road, Highcliffe Christchurch Hants suddenly became Highcliffe Christchurch Dorset. I never quite got over that shock. So we have a very diverse area and a huge marine area as well. Several hundred kilometres of coastline with all the crinkly bits. We have the Solent, of course, Southampton Water and its rivers, the 3 Solent harbours, the Isle of Wight and the South Wight here. And all these coloured lines are actually showing areas designated as marine protection areas. Practically all of the Solent lies under some sort of wildlife designation. A little patch in Portsmouth Harbour where the Navy holds sway. But apart from that, is highly protected. The blue areas are SACs, I'll talk about them in a minute. The green areas are SPAs for birds, and the purple areas are marine conservation zones. And those are probably the 3 main designations that we work with, much of it underpinned by the SSSI Site of Special Scientific Interest designation. So 2009 UK legislation, the Marine and Coastal Access Act, MACA, gave us marine conservation zones rather slowly. We wanted 127 sites designated quite quickly. What we got was 91 sites designated in 3 tranches between 2013 and 2019. And we were left with 3 of them in our region, one at the Needles, Yarmouth to Cowes and Bembridge, none on the Hampshire coast. And since these were being designated, there has been some progress on their management. So the process of going from paper parks, as you often hear a criticism, it's not quite fair. There is management in place. It's a slow process, but we're getting there. Our European marine site designations: historic, special areas of conservation, the SACs for habitats and species, coming from the Habitats Directive initially. We have 2 of them, the Solent Maritime SAC and the South Wight Maritime SAC, which is mainly for reef structures, and the special protection areas for birds. You know, these are historic. They've been translated into UK law after Brexit, but they originate obviously from the EU and very largely drafted by British people at the time. So that's our sort of conservation backdrop to this work, but really we want to talk about spectacular seagrass, and we call it spectacular because we really do believe it is. Seagrasses are the only fully marine flowering plants. It's a generic term. Seagrass is about 70 species. We call them all seagrasses. Within that there are other terms which we'll be talking about shortly. Because they need light, they're generally found in shallow areas, and they do tend to like shelter as well. So lagoons, shallow sheltered bays, if I can say it, harbours, estuaries, or the more marine parts of estuaries, are good territory for seagrasses. And globally, they are some of the most productive marine habitats on Earth. As I say, about 70 species of seagrass worldwide, and we have 3 in the Solent. 2 of them, Zostera marina and Nanozostera noltii, are eel grasses, and the other one, Ruppia, that we don't have so much of, is a tasselweed or a widgeon grass. So we have differentiation, but the seagrass term is the nice sort of generic term. The 2 main species we're going to be talking about are these 2 eelgrass species. We have Zostera marina, the common eelgrass, quite a big plant. The leaves can be 70 centimetres long, even up to 1 metre long and up to 1 centimetre wide. Great green strap-like leaves. Tends to prefer subtidal areas, slightly more sandy areas, although in the Solent we find it growing from gravel to mud. Quite unusual in that respect. And we can get onto Zostera marina meadows on extreme low spring tides. So they extend from the low intertidal down to about 5 metres is the depth limit in the Solent, because our water isn't always crystal clear. Can get down to 10, even 20 metres further west and in exceptionally clear water. Intertidally, we often see this species, the dwarf eelgrass, Nanozostera noltii. Used to be Zostera noltii. It had a bit of a taxonomic revision. Mostly it's sort of the lower intertidal, but it rarely extends into the subtidal. So you can get over a whole meadow on a spring tide, for example. A smaller plant, leaves maybe 20 to 30 centimetres, and much thinner, maybe only 1 to 2 millimetres in length. Some people think it looks a slightly darker olive green as well. So this is at Seaview on the Isle of Wight, a nice Zostera marina meadow, and this is Chilling Beach, just on the east side at the mouth of Southampton Water, a Nanozostera noltii meadow. You'll notice in these little sketches, both of these plants really do well when they're growing from a spreading rhizome mat. That's a key feature of a seagrass meadow. Why are they so spectacular? Well, they're incredibly good for biodiversity because they provide additional habitat. Marine sands and muds are already, believe me, worked on them for 25 years. Incredibly diverse habitats, probably some of the most diverse habitats globally, particularly the deep sea. But a seagrass meadow adds more structure. So they provide habitat for foraging, refuges, nursery, spawning and breeding grounds for many species of fish, crustaceans and mollusks. They really do drive biodiversity. Seagrass obviously is a photosynthetic plant. It's absorbing carbon dioxide and turning it into plant. And it's known as an important blue carbon habitat. The main way that it does that, however, is that it slows down the water and causes lots of sedimentation of carbon-rich material into the seabed, where it can be locked away as a carbon store. Now, David Attenborough says 40 times better than the rainforests. One tropical study, one tropical species. So he very much cherry-picked the biggest number. Now, our Zostera species can get up to sort of, 5 to 7 rainforests worth, but this is a ridiculous number game. One rainforest worth is fantastic. But globally, seagrass meadows may be 0.1, 0.2% of the seabed, but 12 to 15% of global carbon storage. So they really do punch well above their weight. But our meadows, some of them do, some of them don't, and it depends on oxygenation. If the sediment's really oxygenated, the organic material gets eaten by bacteria, turned back into carbon dioxide. If it's anoxic, then that carbon can be locked away, same principle as a peat bog. That sedimentation process helps water quality. We have solid material in the Solent that we may not want to be there. And that sedimentation process can actually help take some of that out of the water column into the seabed and get the bacteria cleaning it up. Also, they absorb nitrates as well, significant pollutants in the Solent. That process of slowing down water, the leaves themselves absorb wave energy, so they form a natural coastal defence. If you have a seagrass meadow in front of your coast, you need less in the way of hard coastal defences, which cost money. It's a classic ecosystem service, a habitat providing a function of value to us. And being the Wildlife Trust, we harp on about the well-being. The science is there. Being in nature is good for people. If you add some water, surprisingly, that well-being quota seems to go up. So even people looking at a postcard of a greenery, if you make it some greenery and some water, there seems to be a bigger effect. And with seagrass, you've got everything. You've got your greenery and your water combined. And they are fantastic places. They are national treasures. But they're under pressure, particularly physical disturbance, things like fishing, dredging, for example. Bottom-toed fishing gear, like this is an oyster dredge scar across a seagrass meadow. If a dredge goes deep enough to tear up the rhizome mat, that's the vulnerable part of a seagrass meadow. The leaves can regrow, but the rhizome mat can take years, if not decades, to recover from physical damage. And things like anchoring as well and mooring from boats and ships also has a real effect, both in dragging up seagrass by the rhizome and traditional anchors and moorings chain, going round and round with wind and tide and eroding the meadow. Water quality, we've already hinted at, it's not great in the Solent, and the organics and nitrates particularly, the sewage input's probably about 30%, but the agricultural runoff about 70% of the nutrient pollution in the Solent, and it causes this massive growth of green algae, perfectly natural species. They would be there in a natural system, having little blooms and dying back again, but turbocharged by nutrients, they grow more and they tend to persist. So we see our mudflats often saying green all summer, and you can see it there growing over the actual seagrass meadow. And then the big things, climate and sea level rise. There was an article in the newspaper today. We have a marine heat wave in progress. Gosport sea temperature is already running about 1.5 to 2 degrees higher than the average maximum for May. And, heat, a couple of degrees is big news for biology. So there are effects from heat and also sea level rise. We have a lot of hard structures along our coast. As sea level rises, our intertidal and our shallow subtidal slowly gets squeezed out, and habitat for these habitats is lost. And disease. I'm going to mention this thing, Labyrinthula zostri. I'll be talking about that in a minute, but it's an important one. So this is our seagrass now in the Solent. We have meadows on the Hampshire coast. That's the one at Chilling I've mentioned, down at Cowshot, but at Bewley, in the Solent harbours, a lot of Zostra noltii in there, and on the Isle of Wight, some massive meadows, Zostra marina. This is a slide where many people say, hang on a minute, there's loads of it. You're talking about conservation and a protected habitat, but there's loads of it there. And this is where our shifting baseline comes into play. Because this might look like a lot, but in fact, it is a fragmented remnant of a once abundant habitat. No one is alive now that can remember seagrass from about 100 years ago. But about 100 years ago, we had, say, 95% more seagrass. This is a vanished habitat. So in that time, the late 20s into the 30s, the wasting disease, it was called, swept through seagrass across the whole North Atlantic. 90% plus of all seagrass meadows were lost across the whole North Atlantic. This is a massive ecological event. And we're, though 100 years is a blink of an eye, really. And so we still have the repercussions of this event. We think there was some recovery through into the 50s, but then anthropogenic, impacts and stresses maybe started holding that back. There was another disease outbreak in the 80s when the agent, a slime mold, was Labyrinthula zostri, was identified. And going back through the herbarium specimens, it was found that this was the cause of the 1920s wasting disease. So now we're in a position where seagrass is present in 20 out of 155 UK estuaries. So we have a vanished ecosystem. This is Osborne Bay on the Isle of Wight, when you can actually see what a magnificent seagrass meadow looks like when the tide is out. And this guy Butcher in 1934 wrote that before the outbreak of wasting disease in Southampton water, eelgrass was formerly very large and abundant, from Southampton up the River Hamble to Bursledon. Not a blade to this day. It just gives us we don't really know the precise numbers, but it gives us a hint of the amount of seagrass that has been lost. We can look at this the other way by looking at some pictures from across the North Sea. These chaps there in their leather waders and scythes are harvesting seagrass on the Dutch coast. Each one of them could harvest 130 kilos of seagrass a day, loaded up onto those brilliant Dutch yachts beached on a sandbank. It would be taken away and dried. Seagrass leaves are naturally very high in silicon. They're naturally fire retardant. They were used as cavity wall insulation and between ceilings, things like that. Lots of other uses for seagrass as well. They were formed into bales and used to make the core of sea defences and dikes. And you can still see 100-year-old seawalls in Holland with a core of compressed seagrass. And in Denmark used to thatch cottages, adding a little bit every year, maybe 400 years of seagrass. So we've gone from an apparently sustainable, harvested industrial resource to a fragmented, protected and endangered habitat in 100 years. That's the depressing bit over. What are our seeds of hope? Pun intended. This is another lovely seagrass. This is Calshot with the ties out. Zostra marina meadow. Fantastic place. So obviously, I think it's fairly easy. We want to protect what we've got and ensure that it has no further damage. And we also want to look and see if we can restore what we've lost. In terms of protection, then this fisheries bylaw, the Southern Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority, which actually, this is 2016 iteration, actually introduced in 2013. These black areas in the Solent are all areas where bottom trode fishing gear is banned. And they correspond with the seagrass meadows at that time. The South Wight similarly is protected for its reef features here. The Sussex IFCA chipped in with some areas in Chichester Harbour. In fact, I think now the whole of Chichester Harbour is a no bottom towed fishing gear zone. And there are further revisions. In 2016, these red areas were introduced just to protect mud and sand flats from bottom towed trawling. And there is an iteration of this bylaw. I think it was started in 2019. Unfortunately, it's still hanging around in DEFRA, waiting for a minister to sign it off, but there is, further iterations improving this. And more recently, we've been working on this project, the Remedies project, a European funded project. We think it was the last European funded project. 5 sites, in this case across southern England, looking at recreational impacts on threatened habitats like seagrass, like merle beds. And our role in this was actually to look at the impact of recreational activity on our seagrass meadows. This is Osborne Bay again, where that huge seagrass meadow is, where the tide is in, and we can see lots of people on the shore, people in the water, they'll be standing on the seagrass, and a raft of boats anchored outside Osborne Bay. And we wanted to get a real handle on the level of recreational activity over our seagrass meadows. But we needed people. Fortunately, we have volunteers, and we produced a survey manual, a lovely recording sheet, multicoloured, always helps. We gave people golf range finders, compasses, information about things like how to record the Beaufort Sea state, and we set them out to just record, armed with their compass and rangefinder and with a map showing where the seagrass is. They could work out whether something, let's say a boat had anchored inside the seagrass or beyond the seagrass, for example. And they did this for 4 years, August and September, once a weekend and once midweek. So it was a big effort at 5 sites around the Solent, not just Osborne Bay. But Osborne Bay was interesting because after the first couple of years of survey, a pattern started to emerge. We could see a lot of vessels travelling outside the seagrass, anchoring outside the seagrass, travelling over the seagrass, and anchoring within the seagrass. Quite a range of vessel types, but really small yachts were very much the key vessel at this site. Not always the case, but it was this anchoring inside the seagrass, an average of 5.3 vessels anchoring per hour in the seagrass. And if you tot that up over the entire sailing season in the summer, that's quite a lot of impact. So Natural England were very interested in this, and they used this data to support the introduction of a voluntary no anchor zone. These 8 buoys marked out a line now. This is a voluntary no anchor zone. That's always the first step in conservation. Do something voluntary, and if people don't do it, then you start thinking about legislation. Sadly, that's often what happens. But we monitored this site last summer, and what we found was that compared with the pre-introduction of the voluntary no anchor zone, we saw some pretty significant reductions in anchoring. And we'll carry on monitoring that for a few years to see if that holds up. Interestingly, the effect was higher at the weekend than midweek. And it could be that maybe visitors are more compliant than locals. This has been found elsewhere, where a student paddled out to every single boat that visited an area down in Devon, in the Studland area. And what they found was that the people that knew more about a newly installed series of eco moorings they could tie up to and not damage the seagrass, the people that knew the most about it were the people that had come the furthest. So local knowledge was lacking because the local people just had been doing it for years. I don't need to find out anything, but a visitor going to a strange place finds out. Quite interesting result, a bit counterintuitive in some ways. So we can see there's been legislation with fisheries buyers laws. We're seeing behaviour change with the voluntary no anchor zone. So, protecting, we think, is starting to make an impact. What about restoration? Ideally, we would see natural restoration, natural recruitment, but over 100 years, that doesn't seem to have been all that great. We do see some new areas crop up, but we also see some losses, and we don't see sort of a massive recovery. So can we drive that with some assisted restoration? So 4 and a bit years ago now, working with Boscalis Westminster, a marine dredging and engineering company that were interested in our work, they started funding our Solent seagrass restoration project. We had always gone out and surveyed seagrass meadows, provide some of the mapping that you can still see online of where the meadows are, but we didn't know anything about restoration. So they got us going. They funded us initially for 2 years, supported staff, and enabled us to find out a little bit about how restoration works. They then funded us for another 2 years, and they've just funded us for another 2 years. So 6 years of funding is pretty good. We've done very well. They're great to work with, and they help us also work with the University of Portsmouth, supporting, for example, some MRes work, and their engineering skills as well. Hopefully will help us one day to really upscale our work. So within the Solent Seagrass Restoration Project, we've got 3 main locations. In Langston Harbour, a couple of sites, one up near the Farlington Reserve and on Langston East. At Sea View, very important site, and at Chilling over on the Hampshire coast. Some of our other supporters there, you'll hear a bit more about Fat Face in a minute. And then more recently, about 2.5 years ago, we were funded by the Environment, Landscape and Seascape Programme for the Solent Seagrass Project. Many more partners involved in this, and also restoring salt marsh, oyster reef and seabird habitat. But our role again within this is to do seagrass restoration, and also actually to run to lead on all of the public engagement work across this project. And this one, the Solent Seascape project, also included Chilling, but introduced Calshot as an area. These maps, these green areas, are where there's existing seagrass that we think we can work with, and areas in Wight that we'd maybe like to restore. And also the Hamble, quite importantly. This is the place where we think seagrass hasn't been for 100 years. And that's a real aspiration, to try and introduce seagrass into areas where it hasn't been for a very long time. How does this work? Ellie's going to tell you about that.
Thanks, Tim. Can I grab that one? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So yeah, as Tim said, the start of the restoration journey is really monitoring and surveying. And we start this in April, which is when we start to see the vegetation growth coming through again. And we're really reliant on the low spring tides for all of our seagrass restoration work. So we really need a 0.7 metre tide and below, which often means meeting our volunteers on the shore at 5 a.m. in the morning, or equally in the evening at 5 p.m. till 7 p.m. And we follow a methodology called Seagrass Watch, and we're doing these surveys across existing seagrass meadows across the Hampshire and Isle of Wight coastline to identify their health and condition. And Seagrass Watch is an international protocol. It's used all over the world. And basically what we do is we lay out 3 50-metre tape measures, and then we place quadrats at 5-metre intervals. Each quadrat is 0.5 metres squared, and that's our sample size. And then we're looking to measure the percentage cover of any seagrass, so percentage cover of Zostra marina or Nanosostra knowltii, any marine life, any epiphytes, so that's anything growing on the seagrass leaves, and that gives us a good indication of water quality. Algal cover, again, gives us a good indication of water quality. But we've also added on a 2 additional columns as part of our restoration work to this international protocol. And that's looking and monitoring for flowering shoots and developing seed. And as Tim said, seagrasses are the only marine flowering plants, and it's really important that we know when they're flowering because it gives us an indication of when we can go out to collect the seed. We've trained over 57 volunteers in this methodology so far. It's Seagrass Watch is used all over the world, but the UK lead is Richard Unsworth, who's the CEO of Project Seagrass. So Tim and I have received training in that from Project Seagrass, which then means that we can go and train fellow volunteers. We went out at the end of last month and we were seeing really positive signs of flowering at 2 of our collection sites, which is Seaview on the north of the Isle of Wight and Calshot on the south of the Hampshire coast, kind of at the mouth of Southampton Water. And we're going out again with volunteers next week to monitor again. But it's looking like the seed is going to be ready towards the end of June, going into early July. And that's when we assemble our army of volunteers to help us collect it. And seagrasses have these seeds in the flowering shoots called spathes. And we go out with a team of snorkelers and waders and go and pick those flowering spathes. So we don't take up the whole plant. We only take the bit with seed in because there's other shoots which might be flowering still, and then that gives them a chance to develop into seed. And it's a really wonderful... Last year we had a week of it. We had 220 collective hours of seed collection. This year we're looking to upscale that even further. We collected 60,000 last year. This year we're aiming for 130,000. So it's looking like we're going to be doing about 13 snorkeling sessions and 9 wading sessions with hopefully 30 volunteers on each. Once we've collected the seed, we then take it... so that's for the Zostra marina species. For the intertidal Zostra species, which Tim mentioned, so the Nanozostra knowltii, but also the intertidal Zostra, which is an ecomorph of marina, because in the harbours the conditions are more stressful, so the plant's a lot smaller, and we get this much smaller seed. But we go out with a team of volunteers, and we wear these bits of kit called mud patterns, which have been used since the 16th century, originally by wildfowlers. And they're basically planks of marine plywood that we tie onto our Wellington boot. That allows us to walk out across the mud without sinking. We then lay down on foam bodyboards and are going through the individual seagrass leaves to find the seed, which we then collect and put into our bucket. That's from October to November, so it's a really nice cycle in that we've got the Zostra marina seed production happening in the summer, in July and August, and then the intertidal Zostra producing seed in October to November. When we've collected the spathes, we take it to the Institute of Marine Science at the University of Portsmouth, and we store it in seawater tanks. And the seawater's coming directly from Langstone Harbour. We store it in outdoor tanks, but we've changed our focus to more of the indoor tanks because we've seen that we've had less problems with algal growth over the spathes. It's left in these tanks for a period to 8 to 12 weeks, and this is where the plant material matures and decays, the seeds mature. Because they're negatively buoyant, they drop out of the spathes down into the bottom of the tank. We then collect them to put into storage. And we've had some amazing help from volunteers as part of this, but we're also looking to work with university students as we upscale this year to help us with this process. We do weekly collections of that seed. So after the initial month, we start to see a lot of seed dropping, and that's when we start to do that collection. And then at the very end, we're left with this mulch material, almost like a compost. And then we go into the labs and we pick through that mulch and that seed and get the last of the seed out, ready to go into our seed storage system, which you can see on the right photo there. The boxes all have a really thin layer of seed in, of different provenance. So we've got the different sites. So these 2 were from Seaview, and this one was from Calshot. Here is our sump, and that's chilled down to 3 degrees centigrade, and it's really hypersaline, so 50 practical salinity units, as opposed to 32, which is the typical practical salinity units of seawater. We've had some issues with marine fungus, which is common throughout the restoration community. There's an international seagrass nursery network call, and they all explain that they have similar problems with this fungal issue. So what we were doing was doing weekly water changes, picking out any seed affected by fungus, agitating the seed, and just making sure that it was as clean as possible before planting. It goes through a 6-month storage period until it's planted back out into the sediment. A couple of years ago, we were using Hessian seed pods to do this planting, so filling Hessian bags with sediment and seed and planting that into the seabed. And although we had some success, we found that when we were monitoring, the bags were quite black and anoxic, and the seeds probably weren't getting enough oxygen. So we've changed our methodology to a method called dispenser injection seeding, which is basically a modified corking glue gun, which you would use as a sealant gun, which we fill with sieve sediment and seed, and then we directly inject that seed into the seabed at depths of around 2 centimetres. And again, this is all with volunteer support. We launched the Solent Seagrass Champion volunteer role in January 2022, launched it on a Friday, came back in on a Monday, and we had 75 expressions of interest. And since then, we've grown, and we've now got 270 volunteers signed up across the 2 counties and afar, to the point where we've actually had to, or for a time, had to temporarily close that opportunity because we wanted to make sure that people who had signed up had the opportunity to get involved. And it's our fastest growing volunteer programme at the Trust, which we're incredibly proud of. As a Trust, we're a team of 150, and as a marine team, we're a team of 5. So we're incredibly reliant and grateful for this support. Because we've had such a fantastic response, we wanted to upskill some of our volunteers to actually lead other groups out on the shore. So we went to Fat Face Foundation, which is the charity affiliated with the clothing brand Fat Face, and they very kindly agreed to support us for the next 3 to 5 years on upskilling some of our volunteers to become seagrass survey leaders. And this means that they're trained in seagrass ecology, marine species ID, seagrass watch methodology, but then also have to complete outdoor first aid, water safety training. So it's a big commitment, and we've had a really good uptake from volunteers to be part of this. And that means that, as I said, we're really limited by the number of low spring tides, but if we can have these leaders leading groups of the community out on the shore, it frees Tim and I up to do some more monitoring work, to look at other areas of seagrass restoration, and just means that we can engage more members of the local community. We've had 6 who are trained up so far. We just did our recent theory training on yesterday, and we've had another 9 who have signed up. So we're hoping to get a pool of around 20 over the next couple of years, and we're well on track for that. And we've always had really lovely feedback from people who are involved in the project. I think often there's a lot of doom and gloom around biodiversity loss and climate change, and this is a project that's very practical and hopeful and very positive. So we've had people saying that they really enjoyed collecting the seed. That's a really lovely time of year. And yeah, again, what they really liked about the project was that a clear, brighter future was outlined. It wasn't the doom and gloom story we so often hear. We've also recently launched a Seascape Through Time. As Tim mentioned, we've got an understanding of how much seagrass we've lost across the UK, so over 90% loss. But we don't really have an understanding of how much seagrass we've lost in the Solent. So we've asked our volunteers to help us with this and to help us find some more information. We often have conversations and we get anecdotal evidence. So for example, we came across an obituary which said that a man used to make paper out of Zostra marina on the Isle of Wight, or that wildfowlers in Langston Harbour used to be able to drag their boats out across the seagrass meadow even when the tide was out because it retained so much seawater. And we've lost all of this. So having that information and that being fed into an online portal is really useful for us, but it also might lend itself to a future research project. Again, our volunteers have been incredible as part of this, and one suggested actually going into residential homes and speaking to people, especially on the Isle of Wight, who have lived by the coast their whole life, who might be 70, 80, 90, and have got so much lived experience, which is incredibly valuable for us, but also hopefully they feel that they have a sense of value in contributing that information. I'll pass back over to Tim.
Thanks, Ellie. It is true. I mean, our volunteers are so important, and if you look back at the photos with volunteers in, you never see a volunteer not smiling. Which, I mean, data is confusing. It can lead you to believe that maybe they have a smiling disease. But no matter what we throw at these wonderful people, they always seem happy and smiling and enthusiastic. So we've been going now, really our first deployment was in December 2021 in Langstone Harbour. And you can see there's a whole history of deployments at Seaview and Langstone Harbour. This transition from our initial large Hessian seed pods, getting very anoxic. We tried slimming them down, flattening them, less material. We called them ravioli pods. Not much difference. And our transition to dispenser injection seeding. So most recently, in April, we put out 25,000 seed Zostra Mariner at Seaview. At Langstone Harbour, a smaller number, just over 2,000 intertidal Zostra seed there. And over the years we've tried different seeding densities and patterns, for example, as well, because we want to grow seagrass meadow. The seed is so precious to gather, hard to gather, precious to store. We want to make the most of it. At Calshot, within the Solent Seagrass Seascape programme, 2 deployments now, most recently 30,000 seed this April in the most appalling conditions. On a day when we were supposed to have 2 hours at low water, it was a freak tide, we had 17 minutes. We had to go back the next day and you can see, again, try and find a face that isn't smiling. And you can actually see our pattern of planting there. In these metre square quadrats, each quarter metre, we inject 5 times in the shape of a 5 on a dice. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 in the middle. And the density of seed that you put into the mix can be varied as well. We started putting about 80 seed per metre squared. We're now up to over 300 seed per metre squared. So how are we doing? Well, we've grown seedlings. We've always grown seedlings. So you can see some of our, and it is a joyous thing when you go out to an area after a couple of months and actually see some seedlings, because you've waited literally all year for this little bit of reward. What we haven't really done yet is grow like a green meadow. So this is, we think, seed viability is an issue. We need to increase our germination rates. We know that we might have some issues with seed quality in Langstone because, again, the water quality in Langstone Harbour isn't always perfect. And so we do have to sort of deal with these ongoing conditions within the harbours. But that said, I think one of our most successful deployments was right at the top of Langstone Harbour up at Farlington, where you can actually see our planting scheme. You can actually see, and this was incredibly rewarding, particularly because this is an area where all the habitat suitability models for seagrass restoration indicated there was no chance of growing seagrass. I don't like to knock modelling, but it sometimes isn't perfect. Let's be fair. So this was last year's planting. We've planted some more again in Farlington this year. Last year, when we went back in late autumn to check out this area, the Brent geese had been across and eaten it all. Now, seagrass is protected in the Solent harbours as a supporting habitat for Brent geese. But sometimes wildlife can really be a pain because it's eaten our restoration experiment, basically. But it might come back if there's rhizome. We also took some seed from this area of Farlington, and about a month ago we planted some of that on the Hamble. So this is a lovely thing. I mean, our sort of social media sites normally get 40 or 50 likes, and this one just went absolutely mental. That on this day, 780 likes, comments, shares. People are really invested in this seagrass work and kind of willing it to succeed. The nice thing about this planting, though, is that if we grow one seedling, we can announce we have grown the first seagrass on the Hamble for 100 years. So we have great hopes. Behind the scenes, of course, everything we do, we pay close attention to the ongoing science. Seagrass restoration is not a done deal. We're still kind of working at the cutting edge of a developing science. We've funded a number of studentships, as Hannah and Bronwyn there worked on biodiversity in seagrass meadows and carbon storage. Emma, fantastic PhD student at Portsmouth, helped a lot greatly. We've had posters, there are papers going to be coming out. And last year, Uresha Rodrigo did some great work, germination trials in the laboratory with different germination media and light levels. And we hope to be following that up as year. She got some great results that, again, are going to be published. So everything that we do, we also trying to back up with our science. So here we are. We need to carry on training our leaders. We will be upscaling our deployments, provided we can collect all that seed that Ellie mentioned. We've had our first trial in the Hamble. We will be surveying. We always look to expand collaborative work, and we work with Project Seagrass also in the Solent. And this is something which needs, you need hordes of people like Smiling People. You need hordes of people like this to try and get this job done. It is not simple. So that's pretty much everything I'm going to talk about. I'd really like to show you a bit of seagrass now. So last 2 summers ago, when we were collecting seed at Seaview, one of our volunteers just happens to be an award-winning marine photographer and videographer, Theo Vickers, on the island, and he came along while we were picking and put together this little video for us. And I think one of the things about this video is that you have to kind of pinch yourself and think, this is the Solent. And it's a very shallow environment at low tide. You drift over these sort of really bright green leaves. There are the seeds growing in the spathes. We snorkel over the seagrass. Very gentle action, really, just trying to pick off individual spathes, and you can see how shallow it is. With no need for aqualungs here. But it's a hard job, but it's a lovely job as well. Again, more spathes and seed. They tend to sit up quite nicely. Shore crab, our friendly shore crab, one of the most destructive invasive species globally. And a stalk jellyfish is a conservation importance species. Rather lovely striped flatworm. Snakelock's anemone, of course, photosynthesizing with its symbiotic algae. Pipefish, very close relative of the seahorses. So shallow, in fact, I've stood in this meadow and someone has walked along, pipefish courting dance. Stood on that meadow and someone has come along asking, what are you doing? I said, doing seagrass. What seagrass? It's there. And that's one of the things, it's a hidden habitat that not many people know about. I mean, that when you in that seagrass meadow, you think this is every bit as good as something that you might see on the blue planet. Okay, no manatees, no dugongs, but we've got cuttlefish, we've got stingrays, we've got bass, we've got spider crabs. They are, the world-class environment right on our doorstep, all over the Solent. And although there are all the sort of compelling reasons, scientific reasons, well-being reasons, I think the most compelling reason for doing this is they're just fantastic. And we really, we would all benefit from having a lot more seagrass around. So thank you very much. I'm just going to put this one. But also, so I'll put this up, there are also some members in the room, which is fantastic. I'm sure all the members will tell everyone here how fantastic we are. If you would like to support us, then there are ways that you can do that. So thank you very much from both of us.